I have had so many misconceptions about the Somali people up until I started reading a little bit more about the Somali people. And at this point, I've read about 10 books about the Somali people, mostly books written by Europeans, but I've also read books written by people like Ibn Battuta, who discuss the Somali society. So I've taken some time to try to understand the Somali society. And in this video, I'm going to go through 10 of the misconceptions that I heard about the Somali people. Now, the first misconception is that the Somalis are an ethnic monolith. And when I say an ethnic monolith, I mean that I used to think that Somalis were just one same person, if it makes sense. But reading through these books, I've discovered that actually the Somali society is very diverse, ethnically speaking. It is a people who are very rich in different varieties of people. And within the Somali society, you will have the Somalis, of course, of different clans, the major clans, of course, but you'll also have people of other variations, if it makes sense. For example, the Jarer or the Bantu, as they are popularly known. You'll also have people like the Gibilhad, who are like could be descendants of the Arab immigrants. You would have very recent migrations of Arabs. You will also have the Benadir people of the coastal city-states like Mogadishu and Marka. You'll also have a community like the Brava people. So it's a very rich society when it comes to ethnic diversity. And that's something I did not know. But now I know after reading through these books and also having a lot of conversations with the Somalis themselves. Number two is that the Somali society is a more recent society, or maybe I should say is a more recent identity. And this is something I've always thought, and I think I've got this from other sources where people will mention like Somalis are just recent emergence of an identity out of the merging of the Arab people and the local natives of the north of the Horn of Africa. By reading through these books, I've come to realize that actually the identity of a Somali is not a very recent emergence. It's an identity that goes back probably thousands of years. Of course, the oldest mention of people who could be very closely related to the Somalis is in the book that is written by Herodotus. The History is a book that I've read, a very interesting book, a book written close to maybe 2,500 years. It's a very old book. And in that book, he talks about traveling to Egypt and then traveling up beyond Egypt and going to the lands of the Macrobians. Now, the Macrobians, many people agree today that the Macrobians are probably the ancestors of the Somalis of today. Now, the third misconception I had, and I think this is a very interesting one, and I even feel ashamed to think that that's what I've thought for very many years, and that is that all Somalis are pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists, that every Somali just lives off keeping animals and moving from one place to another with those animals. Now, that is the impression I've had for very many years, and I don't know where it came from. Could be textbook in schools, and maybe in Kenya we learn about the pastoralist communities, the Maasai, the Somali, Borana. So maybe that's where I got it from, and of course history is always simplified, and sometimes for a good reason, but often the simplification leads to a very bad results. For example, people having these beliefs that are not actually very accurate. And reading through these books, especially reading Virginia Luling's book, Somali Sultanate, the Geledi City-States 150 years, I come to learn that actually Somalis, yeah, they did have a section of that society, or they still do, of course, who are primarily pastoralists. But there is also another large section of Somalis who are not pastoralists or nomadic pastoralists, and these are people who are settled. They include the people at the coastal towns like Zeila or Mogadishu or Marka, and these are people who in the cities, those are people who will do trading mostly. They will do business, imports and exports, and that has happened for thousands of years. If you read books like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, of course, he describes, or the writer describes, these cities that used to do a lot of trade, and also, of course, Ibn Battuta mentions it also. And so there are the coastal cities that were a lot into business, trading, export and import, and that's a huge community actually. And then there were farmers of southern Somalia, maybe we could say the Shebele Juba Valley region, that region, and also between the rivers. Turns out there is a lot of farming that has happened there for quite a long time. And there is a huge section of the Somali society that is settled and primarily does farming. Of course, they do keep animals and they do trading as well, but primarily doing farming. And I found that to be very interesting because it is a side of the Somali society that I did not I did not even think about. And here is something very interesting about that perception or misconception I had. Actually, the very first Somali I ever met in my life is a guy who was a farmer. He used to lease land around where I grew, and he used to lease very huge tracts of land, actually. I'm talking thousands of acres. And he was very successful. And that's the very first Somali I ever came into contact with. And I remember him coming, and sometimes my mom will serve him tea, and he used to talk a lot. And then he had another Somali guy he had hired to take care of some of his farm, to look after the farm. And he usually will come in the evening and we'll have a lot of conversation. Not me, I was a child, but the adults, and he would join them. And yeah, they were farmers, but it never clicked that actually Somalis do farming. I don't know why. I think it's more, I took more of the book than understanding, looking around and be like, hey, the first Somali I ever met too were actually farmers. Yeah, so there is that aspect, that misconception that they're just nomadic pastoralists, while in actuality, they do all these different things. The fourth is closely related to the third misconception, and it's about the food. I've always had this misconception that the Somalis basically just eat meat and milk, nothing more. That traditionally speaking, that is. And then I was like, if they eat something else, it's something they acquired from the Italians, spaghetti and rice and things like that. So I thought traditionally they eat meat and milk, and then maybe later on they acquired a taste for, we could say, Italian cuisine. But then I read this book and I realized actually I was very, very wrong. The Somalis have a large, we could say, a long list of different foods that they prepare traditionally, from sorghum and bananas and meat, of course, and all these different things that they will make with the wheat flour and sorghum flour and maize, and they have all these different foods. And I found this to be very, very interesting. Especially, I got this from reading Virginia Luling's writings. She describes in detail the Somali cuisine, and I found that to be very interesting. But even before then, even before reading Luling, I had read Ibn Battuta, who traveled, of course, to the East African coast, could be in the 13th century, and he went to Mogadishu. He describes his stay in Mogadishu. He makes the point of describing the food, the different fruits and bananas and different types of food cooked in different ways. He does actually explain some of the foods that he did have to eat while in Mogadishu. And of course, Mogadishu is just one face of the Somali society. Baluling also provides us with a face in the settled farming Somali society. And also we can find a different phase when you read a book like 17 Trips Through Somaliland by A.G.C. Swain, who gives us a different face of the Somali society, including their food, actually. So the misconception is that I thought the Somali cuisine was so simple, but turns out that the Somali cuisine is so complex and rich and wide and has a lot of variety. Now, the fifth misconception I had is about the treatment of women in the Somali society. I believed, or I came to have this perception that the Somalis have no respect for women for some reason. And the women have no say in that society. The women are just, yeah, let me say, property. But then reading these books, going as far back as could be, let's say, let me start with Swain in 1895. He describes the position of the Somali women in that, the position of women in the Somali society. And there is a place where he makes very interesting comments in that book. He talks about meeting a young girl, not very young, a young lady, and she was very happy driving a huge herd of camels, and she was very proud. And they ask her, why are you so happy? She's like, my father gave me all these camels because I'm getting married, and my father decided to give to me all these camels. And then he tells us that actually Somali women used to own animals that they will be gifted by their fathers, especially. And I was like, that's very interesting. That goes contrary to what I've always believed. So these women will own camels, animals. Now, Virginia Luling also tells us about the organization of the Southern Somalis. And she tells us that the Southern Somalis usually prefer the women to marry within their clan. And the reason why is the land. And she says that actually in the Southern Somalia, the farming community, women will inherit land from their fathers and, of course, from their mothers. And when a woman inherited land from her parents, that land was hers for good. There was nothing like it was going to belong to her husband when she gets married, nothing like that. It was her land. She keeps it until she hands it over, or her kids inherit it from her. And I found that to be very interesting because this was a cultural practice that is so different from other parts of Africa where women don't own land. Even today, actually, is a very uh, sensitive topic. Even in Kenya, for example, there are laws that now say, oh, if you are a father, you need to allow your daughter to inherit a piece of your land. But most people are very uncomfortable with that in very many Kenyan societies, that they will not feel comfortable having their daughters inherit a piece of land. That used not to happen in very many communities in Kenya. But turns out that in the southern part of Somalia, it is a tradition that has been there for very long time, that a father will have their daughters inherit a piece of land. Of course, maybe not as equal as the sons, half of what the sons get, but she gets a land, of course. That still is a lot, especially when you compare it to what has been happening in the rest of Africa. And even in Europe and the US, until very recently, women will only own land up until before they get married. The moment they get married, they used to lose the right to own the land. But among the Somalis, they own land, and that was a huge misconception that I had. Now, the number 6 misconception I had is that before colonial time, the Somalis did not have governments. They did not have states. They were just people roaming the land with their animals. Of course, this is a misconception that applies to most Africans, especially from the West, that Africans are not, I believe the same even for the rest of Africa. It's not just the Somalis. Until I started reading, and then I realized actually I've been misled by history that is taught in school to believe that maybe there were a few communities that had kings and those ones had governments, but the rest of Africans were just these people who did not know what a government is. But turns out most of Africans were republics and or republicans. They lived in republics that were very complex. They almost had the Geddah system. The Somalis had sultanates, and some of them grew to become very powerful. The Ajurans, the Geledi, the Adal Sultanate, they grew to become very, very powerful, and they were very, very organized, and they did trade with others internationally. And that's very interesting. That's rich history that often is lost. Is very unfortunate that I did not know that until I started reading for myself, and then I realized, oh, there is a very interesting history that is about these people. They've had very organized governments and states and commonwealths throughout history. Their knowledge about government and statecraft did not start with colonization. They did, in fact, they did better when it comes to managing their politics before colonization. And then, of course, colonization came and introduced new ideas. And it's not just Somalis who are struggling with this. The rest of Africans are struggling with trying to reconcile the idea of government from Europe with the idea of a government to an Africa or in Africa before colonization. Misconception number 7 is that I thought Somalis did not know how to read and write before colonization. But then I'm reading this book. I read Ibn Battuta's book, about his travels, that is. And he talks about going to Mogadishu in the 13th century, I think, if I'm not wrong. And actually, there is a state, a flourishing state there. And not just that, the people are keeping records, and writing is happening. He attends a court proceeding, and there is a lot of documents, there is writing, there is communication between the court and the sultan. There's a lot of writing. Now, even the more interesting for me was reading Richard Barton's book, from First Steps in East Africa, a book written in 1850s, actually, a very long time ago. And of course, not as long as Ibn Battuta, but still close to 200 years. And he talks about visiting Zeila. Now, Zeila was this very interesting city along the coast of Somalia today. And he goes to that city and he meets the people. He tells us about the people, the settlements, the houses, and he's told about mosquitoes and malaria, which he dismisses as superstition. Of course, 50 years later, it is discovered that actually the people who told him were right. Mosquitoes do spread malaria. Now, something he tells us also is that they used to keep records of births and deaths. Now, that's very interesting that in Zeila 1850s, they used to keep a town, a city in the Horn of Africa in 1850s. They did not just read and write. They kept records of deaths and births. And there was somebody who had that responsibility of keeping records, and he was given access to those records. And he said those records went back, I think it says like 300 years. From 1850s, go back like 300 years, there are records of people born in the town and people dying in the town. So they used to read and write. Very interesting. Of course, he's also talking about going to Harar, and he meets a gentleman who has a home library. Now, of course, we can say that Harar is not really a Somali society, but it's interesting that in that region, that was possible that you run into an individual with a home library, a native actually. Misconception number 8, that Somalis do not do manufacturing. Reading, I think, is the Periplus of Eritrea Sea. He kind of like talks about trading, buying of goods along the coast of Somalia, and the goods that came in and those that were taken. And also, Bin Battuta talks about trading. He talks about textile, and this is where I want to come to about manufacturing. He mentions textile, and I did read another document by a Portuguese explorer, maybe 15th century could be. He also talks about trading or in Brava and also Mogadishu and those towns along the coast, those city states. But the person who brings it out very clearly and very interestingly is Virginia Luling in her book, The Geledi Sultanate, or the Somali Sultanate, Geledi City States, 150 Years. She talks about the Somalis and textile industry, weaving for clothing. And that was a skill that was so much into the Somalis of the southern part. They were so much into weaving, they would weave and create textile products. And she mentioned something interesting, that actually they used to plant the cotton, but at some point the cotton there was either not enough or it was not doing very well. And they used to import raw materials from India. We are talking 200 years ago. They used to import raw materials from India. They bring them to Somalia, Mogadishu, and Afgoe, Geledi, and they create textile products and then they are exported. That's very interesting. But I do not think that was even remotely possible in the Horn of Africa. But I found out that actually that used to happen. Number 9 is the misconception that Somalis are just hostile to other people, even for no reason. I used to believe that Somalis are not friendly people. They are just hostile people. They don't like other people. They will just not really want to interact with other people. But reading some of these books, I come to realize that actually Somalis are very friendly people, very welcoming, very accommodating, but with a caveat, of course, which is very clear reading H.G.C. Swain's book, reading Richard Burton's book. It becomes very clear that Somalis are generally very welcoming, very warm, but what they dislike is disrespect. They are very sensitive to disrespect. And once you understand that and you don't show them disrespect, generally they are very friendly. That's a perception I did not have. I had the opposite of that. Now, misconception number 10, the last one, is that the lands of the Somalis is just a desert and there is no much when it comes to flora and fauna. That's what I came to believe, that the lands of the Somalis is arid, primarily very arid. And that also meant that there are no many plants you can really see there. There is no variety of plants on that land, and there is also no variety of animals. But then I read Richard Barton's book, First Steps in East Africa, and then I read H.G.C. Swain. In fact, both these individuals do a very good job trying to capture the flora and fauna of the land. Um, and then I get this very interesting picture. Richard Barton tells us about the elephants and the plants and these big trees that maybe have been there for thousands of years, probably. Then AGC Swain tells us, in fact, AGC Swain gives us a list of different animals, the gerenooks and the deeper tags, and some of these animals, the hunter beast, especially talks about the hunter beast that is only found in that region, nowhere else in the world. And there are so many other animals that AGC Swain lists that are not found anywhere else in the world. And then he tells us about the existence of large herds of elephants and buffaloes. And he talks about the elephants that land used to have so many elephants. And many of them started being eliminated beginning the 19th century with what he calls the sportsmen from Europe. And I found that to be very interesting. I came to realize that actually the lands of the Somalis is very rich, or used to be very rich, in flora and fauna, and that was opposite of what I always thought. Yeah, so those are my 10 misconceptions about the lands of the Somalis and the Somalis themselves. Yeah, those are my random thoughts.